Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey now, today we're going to take a look at March of the Ants from Weird City Games, which has one of the most interesting themes I've ever encountered in a board game, and that is that you and the other players each have a colony of ants, and you are trying to spread out that colony and gain colony points by evolving your ants, making your colony stronger, controlling as much of the meadow in which the game takes place as possible. And honestly, if you're not intrigued by that at this point, you must be playing more ant-based games than I have been. It's a sort of Euro area control game with some really interesting elements to it. So before I say too much, let me go ahead and give you a brief overview of how the game is played, because there's quite a lot of things to go over here. And then we're going to come back and I'll let you know what I think. Alright, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of March of the Ants. This is normally a competitive game for 2 to 5 players where you play rival ant colonies who are all in sharing paths along the same great meadow, and you're trying to kick out the other ant colonies or just gain as many colony points, i.e. victory points, as possible by either evolving or taking over as much territory as possible or just having the best and most efficient colony. Now, I should also say that you can play the game solo or fully cooperatively by using some special rules on the other side of one of the player mats. You have some special rules for using some centipede cards. Some cards in the deck are marked as centipede cards. You'll separate those, shuffle them up, and then it's basically you, or either by yourself or with other players, fighting back against centipedes. But most of the game still remains the same. You're still trying to get as many victory points as possible, so I'm not going to cover that in too much more detail. Now, each player is going to start with a player mat and cubes of their own chosen color. 5 of them are going to start in the larva chamber, so therefore they count as larva. But 1 cube is going to start in the Great Tunnel, which is the central area where you're going to be building all the hexes off of. And any cube that is in the meadow, which is the entire board area, all the hexes combined together, is considered a full-fledged ant. Now, you're also going to start with 2 food, which I forgot to put out on, and don't spin the Great Meadow around. That is not a good thing to do. So you'll start with 2 food in your food stores, which are going to, food is important for a couple of different reasons. One is that you need to feed your ants, not your larvae, but your ants that are out in the meadow every round. And if you can't feed your ants, then they're going to cannibalize your larvae. But also, food is what you need to feed your army and all the different things that you want it to do, for most of the things that you want it to do, such as exploring and marching. Each player is also going to start with a couple of cards off of the main deck. I'll get back to those in a second. You have the rest of your food stores. You have these tokens, these double-sided tokens, which count as either wormhole tokens when they're out in the meadow. Wormhole tokens will actually connect together so that the ants can travel between the wormholes, or they're going to be big, nasty centipedes, which if they end up in your area, you may, or on your hex, you may have to fight them. You'll decide who's going to go first, and then play begins. And the way that this game works is that every player is going to have the opportunity to take an action. When someone takes one action, other players have the opportunity to react to that action, and then play passes to the next person until 2 players decide to rest and essentially drop out of the round. One of the type of actions you can do is an explore, which is going to cost you a food from your stores. When you decide to explore, you draw a tile off the top of the stack, and then you place it next to the Great Tunnel, which is the big central area where everyone can start off at and where no battles happen, by the way. And you'll notice that these are different colors on top because these are starting hexes, which will vary depending on the number of players, and they're different from the other ones. Now, on the hexes, I'll go ahead and show you some of these now. You have, first off, you have little tunnels that will connect to the Great Tunnel and to other hexes as well. But then you have these control areas. Now, when an ant moves onto a tile for the first time and there are open control areas, they can go into those spots. And if they have this area in particular, they're considered having control of the hex. And with that, and with the other areas on the board, the inhabitable areas, they can gain more resources at the end of the round, such as these are larvae. So here's a 2 larvae, and these are 1 larva. If you have ants here in these spaces at the end of the round, you're going to gain extra larvae, and this is food, so you'll get an extra food as well. If there are no empty spaces, ants have to go into the outskirts, which may cause battles. Here's some other ones. This is a wormhole, so when you see this, you're going to put one of those wormhole tokens out, signifying that there's, if another one shows up or more, those holes are connected, and ants can travel between there for 1 movement. This is actually colony points. So if you were to have control of this at the end of the round, you'd get an extra colony point. This control point is for a card, so you actually get to draw an extra card from the deck. This means centipedes are there. Centipede token will come out on this tile, and then you're going to have to fight it potentially. And if you want to play in the sort of advanced mode, there's a few extra tiles, the meadow tiles, which have special effects depending on what they are. So the Abandoned Spider's Lair, each other player reveals one card from his or her hand. You may choose one card, play it immediately, paying all costs. That card's owner gains larva equal to the cost of the card. Or the Nuptial Garden, when this hex is played, draw and reveal ant cards until you reveal an evolution. You may play that card for free and discard the rest. So those are an example of some of the tiles you might come across when it's your turn to explore. When you take that action, you'll just draw one off the top. Line it up as however you want, so long as you have at least one tunnel connected to where your ants were coming from. And then if you have ants in an adjacent tile, you can go ahead and freely move them in there into a control site. Otherwise, they might have to end up in the outskirts. So let's just say that blue had done that, and blue just goes ahead and takes control of that, and then that would be his action for the turn. Now, as a reaction to that, all the other players have an opportunity to take a larva from their nest and put it onto any hex that they inhabit, including the Great Tunnel. So if I was the blue player, I could only put it here because right now this is the only other hex that I inhabit, and because there's an open spot, I can actually put it right into there. But this is only if I was the one who was reacting to someone else taking the explore action. But if it was the red player, they could put it in the Great Tunnel here. They would not be able to put it here because they don't have any ant inhabiting there. The next type of action you can take, which also costs a food, is marching. Marching means you can move up to 5 steps. Essentially, it gives you 5 movement points. You can use those points for every point you spend. You can move one larva from your larva chamber onto the Great Tunnel, which makes them into full-fledged ants, or you can move ants that you already have out in the meadow area and move them one connected hex away, which could be including moving them into uninhabited spots on the other explored hexes. Now, as a reaction to that, each other player may move one ant one step just as sort of a consolation. And the only other action that will cost you food is foraging. Foraging means you get to draw 2 cards from the deck, and as a reaction to that, every other player gets to gain a larva. They take it from their stock, not like that, and puts it into their larva chamber. Now, you may also choose to use your action to play a card. So I'll go ahead and explain the cards now. There are actually 3 different types of cards. There's evolution cards, goal cards, and event cards. And I'll cover just a couple examples of those. Now, evolution cards are going to go on the 3 spots on your player board. And it's a benefit because if you can get a full set of evolutions, all 3 cards, you're going to get bonus points right away. So it's a good thing to do. So here's some examples. Here we have the abdomen evolution. First off, this is combat power. I haven't covered combat yet, but this would be the combat power this card would lend. But here is the cost for actually playing the card. So it says that it costs 3 either ants or larvae. So when you choose to play the card, you have to sacrifice either larvae or ants out in the meadow in order to pay for it. And when you do, during harvest in the queen phase, you may collect 1 additional larva from up to 4 single larva collection sites that you inhabit. So the abdomen cards would go there. Here's a flying thorax is an example of the thorax cards. Your ants may move from any hex to any other hex with 1 step. This cannot be used with the explore action. Then you have an example of a head, the blasting head. At the start of the soldier phase, you may sacrifice one of your ants from a contested hex. If you do, discard the top card of the deck and destroy any ants in the contested hex equal to its combat strength, which is very, very powerful. Now, also, having evolution cards gives you a special benefit. Each one gives you a different type of benefit. So, for instance, every head evolution card that you have, because they'll stack up on top of each other and override pre-existing ones, that's going to give you an extra combat strength. For every thorax that you have, you get to move an additional step during the marching action, and for every additional abdomen evolution you have, each food that you spend to feed your ants feeds 1 additional ant. Normally, food can only feed 4 ants per food that you choose to spend from your stores at the end of the round. Going back to some of the other cards that are in the game, you have the colony goal cards, of which you're allowed to have 2 in play at any time. They also have a cost and combat value as well. For instance, Xenophobic Tribe, when played, place 2 larvae into a hex you control. Each slumber, which is like the end cleaning phase, you gain 2 colony points if you inhabit all of the collection sites in 3 or more hexes. Then you have colony goal dedicated evolution. When played, draw a card. Each slumber, gain a colony point for each body segment where you have 2 or more evolutions. Then we have event cards. Let me get a little bit closer in here, maybe if I can. Alright, that's probably good enough. Event cards are just like things that you play, they happen, and then you put them in the discard pile. So this one costs 2 ants, epic cache of eggs. Gain 6 larvae. This card cost must be paid with ants as it's indicated up there. Then you have rapid mobilization, which costs you 2 of a larva or an ant. You may move up to 8 steps, but you must move larva before moving ants. So those are just some examples of the many cards that you'll find in the deck. Now, the final type of action you can take is to rest, and that's what this token is for. When someone chooses to rest, they're going to flip this little sun token over to its moon side, and that means that it's getting close to the end of the round because this player has chosen to rest. Now, when you rest, you are essentially out of the round. You can't take any more actions, although you can still react to other people's reactions. Oh, speaking of which, I should have mentioned when you choose to play a card, the reaction from everyone else is that they get to choose a card from their hand, discard it, and draw a new card if they so please. Now, one benefit of actually resting is if you just don't have anything else to do or you don't want to spend any more resources needlessly, if you choose to rest, every turn that would be your turn when he comes around, you have to rest again because you're out of the round, but then you get more and more bonuses. So, for instance, you get an extra larva at the end during the queen phase, which is the resources phase, and then you'll start getting food if you rest again and again. But now the second player to rest, that's going to end the round officially. And that player actually gets to hold on to the first player marker, and they will become first player for the next round. And they'll still get larva for resting once. So once you're done with all of your actions, that's called the worker phase, and you're going to move on to the soldier phase, which is combat, which is if every inhabitable site on a hex is occupied and there are still ants lingering out in the outskirts, even possibly from multiple players, then combat occurs until there are no more contested hexes. When combat occurs, you're simply adding up the number of ants that each player in a contested hex has, and then each player has the opportunity to simultaneously take a card from their hand and then flip it up and add the combat value of their card, ignoring everything else to their total. They also get to use any head evolution bonuses that they get from having evolution cards or any special abilities they might have first. Whoever has the higher total is the winner, with ties going to the defender. Whoever loses has to lose ants equal to the winner's army strength, which was the original strength of their army based on the ants in the hex, or the winner actually has to lose ants as well, but it's only half of the invading armies or whoever's army strength. Also, whoever is the winner is going to gain a colony point, and if now that opened up spots in the hex, then they would be allowed to move into those now inhabitable spots. Then we go to the queen phase. In the queen phase, everyone gets to collect all their resources for the hexes that they inhabit. I know I probably should have been putting more hexes out here to make it look more grandiose. So just picture that there'll be a lot more ants out here, more hexes, as it grows more and more outwards. So you'll harvest all your resources from the inhabitable spots that you have. Then you'll have to feed your ants. Remember that one food feeds 4 ants unless you have more abdomen evolutions. Then it's time for the royal decree. The royal decree is basically the queen giving her subjects a benefit, which is your choice. You either gain 2 food to put into your stores, or you can take 5 larvae. And since larvae are hard to come by, you might choose to do that instead. Then you go to the slumber phase, which is essentially when you gain your victory points, any that you hadn't gained already for things like evolutions or for winning combats. You gain 1 victory point for every hex that you control that is in the inner meadow. That is, the hexes that are directly adjacent to the Great Tunnel. Those are going to give you extra victory points, as well as any stashed colony goals that you have that you had acquired and played before, though that I think all of those kick off during the slumber phase. And that's really it. Every time that you finish a round, you're going to move up the round marker. You can play a quick game or a full game, but eventually you're going to get to the end. Then you're going to add up all of your points. Whoever is the highest on the colony track after the final round is going to be the winner. That is a quick and dirty run through of March of the Ants. Let's get to my final thoughts. All right, we always talk about theme and components first. The theme of the game, as I already mentioned in my intro, is just awesome, really. I don't know, I have kind of a fascination with ant colonies. I'm not like into insects, and I really could do without 99% of the insects in the world. I'm okay with them not existing, even though I recognize that they should exist because of ecosystems and blah, blah, blah. But ants really fascinate me because they're everywhere. I read some story about this like mega colony that spreads over continents, which is just amazing to me. And it's like this well-oiled machine. I remember in D&D, one of the extraplanar races you could run into, I think they were called Formians, and they were, or it's Formians or Formorians. One of them's a giant, one of them's ants, but one of those, they're like these extraplanar, big, intelligent ants, and they are in the plane of law, and they just have like this giant hive. And I mean, the whole concept just fascinates me, that you have this like well-oiled society of like this hive mind. I don't know, it's just very interesting. I'm not going to go into all my thoughts on ants, but I'm so happy that there's a board game based on that, because it's just a theme that I think should have been touched on a long time ago. So I dig that quite a bit. And when a lot of the thematic elements come out through the gameplay, you have the different evolutions and the head evolutions and the thorax and the abdomen, and I like all that. The only issue I have is that some of that seems less than scientifically sound, but that's fine. I don't think the game is trying to be like uber scientific, although it does have quotes from, I'm assuming, are noted scientists in the field on some of the cards. But is there really an ant head that blows up? I would love to think that there is. I know there really is like a fungal spore that is depicted on one of the cards that can like take over an ant's brain, like a zombie thing. That game, The Last of Us, was based off of it. But everything else, as far as like the larva and getting food and fighting centipedes, it makes sense to me thematically, and so I really dig that quite a bit. As far as the components go, that's more of a mixed bag. The board looks really, really drab. This is supposed to be a final version of the game, and I couldn't help but have the feeling that it was a prototype version just looking at the board. I know it probably would have been too much to ask to have ant meeples, but just having cubes is a bit of a bummer, because in some ways that detracts from the theme. At a certain point, when you're just trying to, when you get through a couple rounds of the game and you're just trying to take over as much territory as possible and move cubes around, it really feels like a cube pusher in some respects. But then you get dragged back into the theme when you see the cool evolution cards and stuff like that, but that was kind of a bummer. So I do wish that the physical components were a bit better, although I really, really like the artwork on the ant cards themselves. Those are great, not only the event cards, but the actual depictions of the different segments of the ant evolution is great. I love how they line up there. So there's good with some bad there, but for the most part, it's decent. As far as the gameplay goes, it's really interesting. I've played a lot of different area control games. I've played a lot of different games that have, I don't know what the proper name for this is. I suppose. I don't know if there is one. But the whole taking an action and passing thing, which I've seen in so many games lately. One of my favorite games, Imperial Settlers, uses that, where everyone gets to take one action until someone passes. And if you pass, you're out. March of the Ants does something very interesting, where if you pass, you get a continuing benefits the longer it's called resting. The longer you rest, the more benefits you get in food and larva, which is really interesting, because then people who are still in the game and are really stretching their resources thin to get as many actions as possible are also going to be at a disadvantage compared to that player or players, well no, just be player, who is accruing these resources and giving themselves a leg up for the next round. That is really interesting to me, and it's interesting that the second player that rests is the one who gets to go first in the next round. So that's a mechanic, and that whole idea there of gaining these benefits for dropping out early is something I'd like to see explored more in other games. In Imperial Settlers, if you drop out early, maybe you were allowed to store some of your resources depending on what your faction was, but that's like the only benefit you got for dropping out early, is maybe saving up some cards and resources for the next round. There was no other clear, tangible benefit, at least that I recall. So I really enjoy that aspect of it. The game is very tight in a lot of ways, because you have the larvae that you have in your colony chamber, and then you have to get them into the meadow and then start exploring and spreading out and taking over as many control points as possible, which gets really tense as far as how, you cannot get larvae easily. It's just not that easy to do. And then it's not easy to get food either, but food is the primary means by which you're going to take most of the important actions you can do during the game. Exploring, marching, it's not enough to just explore a tile. You need to be able to get ants onto it as well. If you're lucky, you put yourself into a position where you can just explore and move some ants onto it right away and take over as many points as you can. But sometimes it's like, well, I want to be able to explore. If I don't explore this section here, someone else is going to. And when you get into later rounds of the game, trying to get those points around the edges of the common ground in order to get points at the end of the rounds are critical, and people are fighting for them. To be able to just take a spot right off the bat is really, really important. And it's like, well, maybe it's worth it for me to explore, even though I can only put one ant onto it right now. If I waste a turn to march first to get ants out of my colony, is that going to be worth it? How many ants am I going to be able to realistically get from from the larva chamber to the meadow onto this control tile, and is that going to be worth it for the food that I have to spend, but potentially 2 food to explore and then to march more out? That whole dynamic is both tense, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately rewarding. I dig that quite a bit. I know I'm saying dig too much, but that's my new thing maybe. As far as some of the other mechanics in the game, the whole way the combat system works, I think I like it. It can feel very punishing at first, but if you think about it, it's just majority control, which is nothing new to any game. You're trying to get as many ants as possible onto one of the tiles in order to have the numbers advantage. If you were forward thinking enough to invest in head evolutions, you're going to have a leg up there as well. And then it just comes down to which of your cards, if you have cards, are you willing to sacrifice in order to give yourself an even bigger benefit if you even need to? So it's not that it's not totally random as far as combat goes, but there is a bit of randomness because maybe you got stuck with cards that only give you a 1 or 2 combat bonus. Maybe your opponent has a 4, which is going to, even if you have the advantage in ants, that might wipe out that bonus. If you're the defender, you win ties, that can be incredibly critical. The one sticking point that I have in the game, like the big sticking point, not enough to make me not recommend it, I like this game quite a bit, but enough that it gives me some pause, and it has to do, it sort of ties together with the combat, is that some cards are clearly better than others, like way better than others. And this is where some of the luck in the game can get a bit annoying, because if you get some really killer cards, especially some evolution cards, you are going to have a huge advantage. For instance, I mentioned earlier, just offhandedly, the head that blows up, the head evolution. That is freaking amazing. Yes, I mean, you can win a battle outright. It's not technically winning a battle. You won't get a point for it, but sometimes it's worth sacrificing that point to get a guaranteed win and to wipe your opponent's ants out. That is just amazing. There are other ones that give you perpetual stream of points and that just let you, there's event cards that just let you take over someone's control point with one of your ants. In other words, there's a take that element to some of the cards that can be a bit frustrating and unbalanced. And I would need to play the game more and more and more to figure out just how balanced those are, because they don't feel like it. Especially since, let's say that someone gets lucky and they draw a lot of evolution cards, which I feel like are probably the best cards to get, even though some of them can be costly and you have to spend larva and ants in order to pay for them, which is another tight balancing act of the game. But having a full set of evolution cards, just having the 3, abdomen, thorax, and head, gets you 3 points. And this game can be really tight in the games that I've seen as far as points go. So that's a huge number to get all at once, on top of the points you're probably going to get from having control of tiles around the central grounds. And I keep calling it that, but I know it's called something else. I'm sorry. It's like the Great Center or something like that. But I just feel like someone could get screwed in the game and not have any of those cards, and that did happen. There were turns where, like in the beginning of the game, I got a handful of evolution cards before I was really willing to pay for them, and later on in the game I was getting nothing but events of questionable usefulness. Like, okay, it's kind of interesting to put centipedes down into other people's tiles, but then if the places I'd want to put them are tiles where they stand to lose the most, but then if they win, they get a victory point and they keep the tile. Is that worth paying, I think it was 4 ants/larva, compared to someone who could spend that amount of ants and larva to get an awesome evolution that might, if it's a head evolution, give them a huge advantage in battle just by merely having it? I don't know. That's my one major issue with the game, is how those cards work, although it's also one of the most interesting parts of the game as well. It's sort of a double-edged sword there. I should mention that there's also a cooperative mode and, sort of hand in hand with that, a solo mode. I have not played the game cooperatively with other people. I have tried the solo mode. It's very interesting. I wonder if perhaps it's too easy. For me it was. Maybe I'll have to try it on a harder mode. But it's definitely an interesting way to sort of maximize your points in the game and get better at it as well. So I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. Overall, March of the Ants is a solid game. It's got a fantastic theme. It's very interesting. There's some really tight resource management and area control elements going on. I wish the cards were a bit more balanced, and perhaps I'll find that they are after multiple plays, but for now I'll offer a word of caution on that. But otherwise, I liked it quite a bit. That is March of the Ants from Weird City Games.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.